Mobile advertising is ultimately about conversions, right? So you read every psychology book out there, everything possible. You study every framework on psychology. And ultimately you get into papers that are, not yet there in the books because maybe you'll get some unique things. And then you apply it and you put it into an ad format that 1 billion people see. And you have this realization that it absolutely does not work. And that, what worked well in a study of 30 students at the University of Stanford or 22 people at UC Berkeley has completely no application to reality. And I think that's kind of the other problem with all the frameworks that, we ultimately do not, until you A/B tested yourself within your own context, you're guessing, and you need to apply it yourself and see how it works and really understand the principles behind it.
Get ready for the ProducTea with Leah, your fun-sized dose of business, tech, growth, and product chatter. I'm your host, Leah, and it's time to spill the tea. Brace yourselves, folks. I've had the fortune of working under this guy at Smallpdf. We've affectionately labeled each other as high maintenance, so this is going to be an interesting chat for sure. He is currently spearheading the efforts as the Chief Product Officer at Lokalise, navigating the choppy waters of the tech world to ensure that they don't get submerged by the AI tsunami. Before Lokalise, he served as the CPO for Smallpdf, helping shape it into the Swiss success story it is today. He also kicked Leah's ass there. Also, did you ever hear of Typeform's meteoric rise? As their COO, he masterminded the company's restructuring and was instrumental in its explosive growth. Silicon Valley scale-ups like Leanpump, Bungle, NativeX have also benefited from his Midas touch. He kicked off his illustrious journey at Nokia because why not that as well? Ladies and gentlemen, get ready for some deep dives, hearty laughs, and maybe a couple of playful jabs from former colleagues. Mike Pilawski, everyone. Mike, how are you doing this morning?
I'm doing amazing. How are you?
I am doing really good. How would you rate this introduction from 0 to Schabouwe?
I don't know. I can tell you 0 to 10 is probably 11. I haven't heard my accomplishments so exaggerated before, so it's definitely an achievement.
Can you introduce yourself to the fools that may not know you?
Sure. So I'm Mike, father of 2, owner of 2 dogs, someone who pretends he can skateboard, so he hangs skateboards behind him on the wall, and someone who pretends he can play music, so he puts a keyboard in the camera view. I think that's about me.
That's everything. Like nothing about your professional career. So that's just who you are. Well, that's fine.
You've done already good enough job explaining that.
Yeah, fine. Fair enough. All right. So this is usually where I talk about what people mean to me or like if they have a connection to me in the podcast. And with you, it's going to be one very special episode because I worked with you for about 3 years. You were my boss at Smallpdf. And I can honestly say that I would not be here where I am today without you. And I was struggling a little bit on how I could summarize this. I've tried anyways. So I think we both have an insatiable hunger to win and to learn at the same time. But most of all, I think what you did for me is that you're one of the very few leaders that I have seen that was always brutally honest, no matter how much trouble this generated for him, and very unpolitical in your message. And I always appreciated this. I always strived to also be someone like this, and it definitely also influenced me in my own positions. And I learned a lot from you. I don't know how to say it otherwise. Like half of my bookshelf, which is now hidden under this blank white cover here in the back, is probably because of recommendations that you gave me. And I read most of these books. I've listened to probably all of them, and they were a big, big help in my life. And without you, I would not be there. So I highly appreciate that. And I'm very, very grateful that we did meet. So I'm very stoked for this episode.
Thank you. That's very kind of you.
Thank you. That was the nice part. So we can talk about the professional side a little bit. You seem to have, in general, a pattern. And let's maybe start from there. And you focus on turning around companies. This is something that you also did at Smallpdf. You're joining at Series B to C. And you seem to be enjoying the scale-up mode from companies when they have figured out their product market fit. Can you tell me in so many words, what did you learn from this in any way?
Sure. So I'll start maybe with why a little bit. So you know me well, and I think what makes me very happy at work is being able to work with great people and see them grow, but also still being able to be hands-on and not being restricted in, being able to contribute to whether it's product design, engineering. And I think Series B, Series C still gives you the chance. And, as you move forward, Series D and so on, there already changes and becomes much more political. And I have to say that's something that I did not particularly enjoy. So kind of got stuck with the pattern. And, you mentioned turnaround. I don't think it's a choice. I'll be very honest. Most of the companies that recruit at Series B or Series C as CPO need some help with the product. It's very rarely happens that there's a company where everything works perfectly and they just have an open position for no reason. So you always join because something is not working well. They've hit some kind of a problem. It's usually, a set of different things, but sort of 6 companies later and probably another dozen or more in advisory role, you start seeing the same patterns, right? And I mean, you've seen them too. The classic one is probably the tech is reaching sort of maturity. There might be a rewrite, there might be a massive refactor. You have to look at, paying that technical debt, maybe thinking about how you can do this big fix while continuing to be competitive. I think the second thing that often happens with startups and scale-ups at this stage is they lose their competitive advantage. So you start with a really unique idea, but every idea can be copied. And by the time you are in the 7th, 8th year of functioning, 3 or 4 copycats showed up. Maybe Google or Facebook really liked your idea and they copied you too. And suddenly you have to reinvent yourself. You have to reinvent the reason for people to pick you. Sometimes you hit the ceiling. Your market was just big enough to get there and you have to expand to a new customer segment or new product line. Scaling operational issues are classic. You kind of cross that 150 people, number. The environment starts getting a little bit more political. You have to start organizing differently. Nothing like you cannot really control everything from the top anymore. You have to move towards the mode where there's much more autonomy, empowerment, and that transition can be difficult. And usually what you also find is that the founder who maybe have been the CPO or the first PM kind of got to the limit of their own ideas on how to fix it, and they need sort of a fresh perspective and someone to come on board. So it's more the demand that shaped my career in that way. That's essentially the opportunities that are out there. And these are great companies with great investors. But so I feel like most companies where they hit that Series B, they essentially start experiencing similar issues and they need someone from outside to come and address them.
Yeah, I think I have an interesting perspective on this because I was in a company when it happened. So I joined 2 hypergrowth startups in my career. One of them was about 13 years ago, and the most recent one was Smallpdf, which I think we met about 3 years ago, roughly ish. I don't remember exactly, but both of them I got in at the bottom as employee roughly 20. And then there was this hypergrowth coming. And I think it was very interesting because on the operational side, everybody knows what's missing in terms of like, hey, we need some kind of alignment on the product side because this is what you need, right? So like we know what the problems are. Everybody knew what the problems were. The tech debt is blowing just everything away. You're not getting anything done anymore. You have too many teams who are in each other's garden. Everybody kind of knows where the company should go, except it's a different direction for everyone. And you just have to figure out one direction to just go into. It doesn't even matter which one it is sometimes. You just need to go somewhere just so you have this kind of measurability in it. And I found that very, very interesting because I remember this entire process of, we need a CPO, we need a CPO, we need a CPO. And I remember quite vividly that back then I also thought like, hey, maybe I can do this, right? But I had no idea because I never had really a role model that was like, hey, this is how you scale up a company. Because also my kind of sample size so far was just one company. And it is interesting how we skew these singular experiences that were happening and then think like, okay, this is how the world works for every startup. Because what happened there, I was 100% convinced that I could do a better job on what was happening in leadership. And it was interesting to see you with this wealth of knowledge to come in and do a really good job, in my opinion, and also how you did it. So this was very, very fascinating. And I wouldn't miss it for the world. I'm very, very glad that we could get through this together because it also ignited it for me, this passion about scale ups, which I did not think that I would have, but I'm fascinated by organizational growth and all the problems that you have. And I think you explained it quite great also why I love advising in this particular space, because whatever you say still has operational impact. It's not going to happen in like 4 to 5 months and then nobody knows anymore whose idea it was. I think from that side, it was a very interesting story. And also like this push to, hey, we have enough cash in the bank. We need to kind of push this out. We need to get into hyper growth mode, because essentially in the end, it is a decision from the company. You can make a lot of money and not grow. You can do that, right? But like this was really inspiring for me from the inside.
Yeah, it was a fascinating journey. And I think where I think I was extremely lucky was that the team was a really strong team, right? I mean, like if you reflect on the Smallpdf team, it was a very strong team. I mean, most of the people are still there, so it is a very strong team. I think both in terms of product design, data, for a very tiny data team, so much amazing talent on that team, and engineering. And I think that was definitely a big thing, because I remember, I think it was the second month I was there when we had like the first big technical disaster that took us, I think, 5 months to recover. Then the second one came. In the meantime, we had to reorganize the company from project based to teams. And you're trying to build new things while you're fixing sort of the engines in the flight. And in the meantime, you're organizing everyone and trying to make sure that, people also don't burn out, don't quit, because it's stressful.
Yeah.
So I think, yeah, but when you have a good team, it's easy, right? It's because everyone supports each other.
No, I think it is interesting because if you look at the risks, so you were talking about these failures that were happening. So like if you would have done a risk assessment before you arrived, right? So like quite when the company was quite early. So let's just say you have a couple of million of ARR and you can stumble into a couple of million of ARR with a good product, right? Like you can definitely do that. But then at some point you also need to grow it. But like if you look at what happens if you have 1 day of downtime, it's not going to be a huge impact on your balance sheet in some way, right? But like a year passes very fast, right? A year passes very fast, and suddenly your revenue is 10x or 5x or 15x. It doesn't really matter. But when you're in hypergrowth, this happens. And then suddenly risks that were not that much of a problem start to become a huge problem, because now 1 day of downtime is actually costing you much, much more, because 10% of 3 million is not the same as 10% of 30 million. So that was very interesting, because with scale, so many things constantly change, whereas the conditions around them only changed, right? So like it's the same assessment, it's the same chance of happening, but things tend to just break also more at scale. And I found that very, very fascinating. And yeah, we had a couple of these breakdowns that were quite fascinating. And I think it was just very difficult for me to kind of zoom out, because I was always busy. When I joined, I was busy with my little thing, like the desktop application, with my team that I put together. And you basically told me, hey, Leah, what you just do there, this is not worth your time. You need to fucking zoom out. And you used harder words, which I'm very grateful for. But I remember I cried in that meeting, and it struck me very hard, because I was very proud of what we did. But you were absolutely right. Like sometimes you just need to make an assessment, like, is this actually worth your time? Because there are bigger opportunities. It's not just about finding something, it's about finding the best thing. And yeah.
Yeah, I think, it's an interesting thing, because first of all, I think we had conversations earlier, but I don't think the sort of the subtle pointers kind of were working. Right. And I fully understand why. You exist within sort of a product line that is exciting. The product looks beautiful. It delivers the value that it promises, but then people don't adopt it. Right?
Yeah.
Or people adopt it, but you're measuring adoption in tens of thousands when the business is measuring adoption in millions. And then you have to take a step back and say, okay, how long can I optimize this small thing? Is really optimizing the small thing worth my time, worth my team's time, when we can optimize much bigger? And I think the broader question for our reach was always, do people really want that? Right? In the end, like, are we building it for enough people? But I think where we struggle as human beings is finding this sort of global maximum. We see sort of the area, the box around us, and we optimize for that box. And we rarely ask ourselves, what if we remove the walls of that box? What would be the most valuable thing for us to do?
No.
It's a very empowering and a very scary question at the same time.
It is. And I think for me, even though I had a couple of startups, I had my own companies, This was really the first time where I was really forced to kind of zoom out, because when you do that, what you also admit in some ways is if you do find a better opportunity, you basically put a label on the other one. Hey, this, I mean, not, it was not a mistake. I wouldn't call it a mistake, but like this was not the best thing to do. And now that you know about it, you should not continue it. And
Yeah.
that is kind of a bias to action, because you and me are pretty much the same in this regard. Once we are aware of something that annoys us or that we just know is wrong, we cannot pretend that it is good.
No.
It's just we just can't. And that is a difficult concept for some people to grasp in regards to professionalism, just standing in front of company and then just say like, guys, this is not working anymore. It just isn't. So we need to do something about it. I don't know what it is, but maybe we have to do something about it. And yeah, I think that was a very interesting lesson for me as well, like to just like zoom out. And I have never let it go since then. But I feel like I also never had the frameworks for it, right? So like I was always expecting to have some kind of framework in some business book to learn how to do strategy and business casing. But I feel like I actually only learned it at Smallpdf because I was forced to do it without frameworks, just by the power of my thinking, knowing, of course, all the metrics and where you can find impact and so forth. But there is just no framework that I am aware of that takes this from you, because every company is so individual and so unique. And then you have this massive, massive, massive user base of 50 million monthly active users or whatever we had. And every decision that you make is just huge. And yeah, it was scary and exciting at the same time.
Yeah, I think, what is important is to make sure you question your assumptions and try to get to the first principle thinking. Why is it happening like that? Why? Get to the bottom. And then you can build your own framework, right? But I think a lot of people, what they are trying to do is they are trying to find a successful company, whether through our friends at Reforge or through some online blogs and talks. They use a framework and then they bring it to their own company and they think it solves all the problems. But actually, the most successful frameworks are uniquely built for that particular company, and you have to figure out how to adapt them. And to do that, you need to understand essentially why things work in your business the way they work.
I think there's two data points that I have where I can say from data that I'm pretty sure that this is exactly spot on. And one of them is that the guide that I wrote in November last year was basically the piece that allowed me to do my career in the way that I'm doing it right now, which is the product-led growth guide. And I felt that whenever I was arguing exactly from this first principles perspective, you need to understand first before I teach you anything about the operative or the tactical side of it, because then you can kind of adopt it. That worked extremely well. And I was scared of writing such a guide because I was always thinking in my head, like, nobody wants to hear this, because why is nobody writing about this in this way? But I started to realize as well that most people are not writing about it this way because they don't understand it themselves, or they're not trusting that the concept that they have, their first principles, because they're challengeable. They're highly challengeable, that they're solid enough. And this is not to knock other people. It's just that this is the way that I want to learn, right? And this is also what I found specifically also in Reforge, for instance, just like a huge credit for them as well. Like a lot of these things that I was learning about growth and some other concepts, they are oftentimes coming from first principles, where you just actually like, hey, look, here's the reason why this works this way. And then you kind of adopt it. And the other thing is, I also structure my courses exactly in the same way. I spend a lot of time explaining people, how is this stuff situated in the market? Why does it work this way that it does? And oftentimes you cannot substantiate it with studies or whatever, right? Which we would love to do, like we do in A/B testing, but this is all you have. And that makes you very challengeable. And it took me quite a lot to get over this and say, like, hey, I think I have something to say. And I think only because it worked so well at Smallpdf to do this, and that you also gave me the freedom to do it, right? So a lot of the good things that we did were because you let me do it with my teams, is the reason why I arrived here at this point. Like first principles thinking is hard to learn skill because you need to get over yourself first. No tactical framework is going to take that from you.
And it's kind of an interesting thing. I learned it maybe a decade ago when I was in two companies in mobile advertising. And Mobile advertising is ultimately about conversions, right? So you read every psychology book out there, everything possible. You study every framework on psychology, and ultimately you get into papers that are, not yet there in the books because maybe you'll get some unique things. And then you apply it and you put it into an ad format that a billion people see. And you have this realization that it absolutely does not work. And that, what worked well in a study of 30 students at the University of Stanford or 22 people at UC Berkeley has completely no application to reality. And I think that's kind of the other problem with all the frameworks that we ultimately do not, like, until you A/B tested yourself within your own context, you're guessing. You're guessing, and you need to apply it yourself and see how it works and really understand the principles behind it.
Yeah, 100%. And I think, I don't know whether you have an opinion on this, but I found it always interesting because a lot of people have written about Smallpdf from the outside, like about the acquisition model and so forth, or like something similar, like business cases, whatever. If you're analyzing that particular company from the outside, you do not get the full story. You do not know where the majority of the traffic is coming from. You do not know how all of this kind of converts. You do not know the numbers behind it. And one thing that I particularly took from this, and I think you were the same, Dennis, like our CEO back then, was also a little bit in the same vein, is that why don't we just talk to our competition also at the same time? Like direct competitors, we don't have to keep things secret because even if you spill your secrets, they cannot take them and put them into their own business. So we had competitors who were offering exactly the same product from a solution point, but a different target segment. And therefore, most of the things that we knew did not work for them and vice versa. And so even if you're in the same vertical, same market, same geography, you just cannot take it. And it is always coming down to what you said. Until you have tested it yourself, you don't know whether it works. And most of the time, you are going to be wrong. So you better get used to it. And yeah, there's just no other way around this.
Yeah, I 100% agree. But I think what I think most people get wrong is they think the strategy, the ideas, there's something special about this. There's very little. And back from my very early years when I was working at Nokia, I remember Nokia predicted iPhone 3 years before iPhone. Nokia predicted Android because I've seen those slides. The strategy team was really good. They could see all of it. It didn't matter because we didn't execute.
No.
And it all comes down in the end to execution. You can, the reason why I am generally not publishing roadmaps online is not because I think there's anything wrong with that. I think it just puts a lot of stress on the engineering team to deliver on exactly the date that you promised there. And that is just sort of unnecessary stress and pressure. But the ideas in the roadmap, honestly, everyone will copy them anyways.
No, I think you also you close the road to learnings along the way because you're already committed to using your resources in another way. And there's just simply no upside for this, except if you believe the tale of sales when they say like, oh, we could close this enterprise business if we promise them something down the road in 6 to 12 months. Which never happens either, but then you kind of mess it up for the entire engineering and product department itself.
And I think customers are more and more skeptical of that, right? I think, unfortunately, we have now so many SaaS startups that did not deliver on what they promised, that the idea that promises are enough, I think, is obsolete.
No. And I think this kind of loss of trust is also why product-led growth is having a moment now. If you have 10 competitors, why wouldn't you go to the ones that you can just try without speaking to Gary, the sales guy? And I know we talked about this also in our pre-talk about PLG before it even was PLG. I know you did some stuff on Nokia. Maybe can you tell that particular story?
No, I think, it's kind of funny because we have this renaissance of PLG, but back in the day, there were many names to that. But, when I started working on Nokia, I think it was 2003, just called it try before you buy. That was the name. Right. And the whole idea was that it was the same idea, that there was a lot of risk. And if people try, they'll buy. And this was a very, very interesting concept, and it worked extremely well. At some point of time, though, we stopped using it for games. And the funny thing was that it actually didn't work as well for games. And I think Jesse Shell did some research on this topic. And what he found is that with a lot of games, the momentum to buy is to satisfy curiosity. right? If you're buying a productivity product, you're not doing this for curiosity. I'm not going to buy, HubSpot because I'm curious how it works. But I might buy a role-playing game to see the game mechanics and so on. So giving people a chance to try before they buy actually was the worst of all the potential ways of selling. And the best way was using a trailer, because it actually amped you up for the story and for everything. But, you had to buy it to try. But I think outside of gaming and sort of like content, story-based, books, of course, newspapers would be really hard to try before you buy, because why would you read it after you've read it? But outside of these products, it works for everything, right? And ultimately, I think why it has so much renaissance right now, there are many reasons, more efficient sales, better for consumers and so on. But I think what really changed in the last, 10, 12, 15 years, well, you used to use Photoshop and Illustrator, and I still use Photoshop and Illustrator. And when I got my first Photoshop, I got this 1,000-page long book, and I've read it, and I've used the exercises, and I got another 1,000-page long book, and I got a bunch of courses, and I did. And I must have invested at least, 3-4 months of really focused learning to master it. And I don't think people want to do that anymore for any product. Right. So part of essentially the friction is I want to see that I can learn this product easy with minimal friction. And if it's not learnable, if it's not easy to use, probably it's not going to have wide adoption in my company. Probably my stakeholders are going to hate me for having to, take courses and so on. So the ease of use and learnability just became one of the most critical factors in buying productivity or any other SaaS products, because honestly, there's very little differentiation in SaaS. If you tell me, like, we can go into any product category and you'll find that the feature overlap is 98%.
No.
So then what's the difference, right? Price, maybe,
No.
but in the end, you'll get your price. So it's learnability and usability.
That is exactly what it is. And I think it took me quite some time to also put together in my head why product-led growth is actually a B2B term and not a B2C term. It's like you said, right? So like, it's try before you buy. But the fundamental difference is that some of these motions do not work the same way in B2B that they work in B2C. And it's not just because of the buyer. It's about the entire process. So in the end, what is product-led growth? Product-led growth is a story about the commoditization of choice in a B2B environment that takes a long ass time to close. What does that mean? It means that if you have 10 different choices, you need to differentiate yourself, of course, against the other 9 choices. And it's like you said, like, the product needs to be easy to learn. Okay, let's say we do that, right? So, and as you said, like, all of these products are kind of the same. So now we have to differentiate ourselves more. You cannot maybe do it to the price, but the pricing model, like, hey, pay us very little, you can cancel at any time. So we start to drive closer and closer to the side of the road as a PLG business. So we're taking more and more risk away. Like, this is the complete opposite than on-premise software, where we just said, like, hey, give us a lot of money. We're going to put this thing in there. If it doesn't work, you're going to pay us even more money because we have these consulting contracts on top. Customers don't want that anymore. But it's not that they don't want it anymore. They don't have to want it anymore because there is some competitor that does it better. So on the core product itself, there is not a lot of differentiation. And this is why I also kind of have to expand everything. And I think the main difference, if anyone is listening to this, to the differentiation of try before you buy between B2B and B2C, is how you think about how you can try something. So B2C customers usually are constrained by a time limit. Try this for 7 days, give it a try for 10 days, and then you have to make a decision. Whereas B2B, it does not seem to work that well, and you have to do it on a usage basis. And this is very, very interesting because it changes so much. And I see so many Series B, Series C companies that still have trials where I bet if Leah comes in, this is the first thing that I'm going to challenge. Why do you have a 14-day trial? Why do you have a 14-day trial? I remember specifically also at Smallpdf, if you have a 100-people company, just the amount of time it takes me to get a hold of you, then you maybe want to see whether the software that I'm trying to get 20,000 for or whatever is good. This is going to take like 3 to 4 weeks without us even trying the product. So you take away a chance of me to kind of close the entire cycle. And there's no way that you're going to make it faster. So fundamentally, a lot of the things are still the same in B2B. Prices are coming down. The deal cycles stay long. And that's how we're just changing it. But yeah, this is also, I think it's a great example how it came from gaming and it actually does not work there.
Yeah, but I think, there's also something else, right? Which we've talked many times before, which is the idea that you're trying to align the value capture, what you're getting paid for, with the value creation, how the value is created for people. Going back to my Typeform days, we've done, I think, 2 different pricing projects at Typeform to really understand and align the value. And there's this classic thing in SaaS that we charge per seats. Like somehow a seat represents the value, right? And then you charge per seats, and then there's a poor person on the other side who every month has to monitor whether every seat is used and everything is active and people are actually getting value, and then remove seats and add seats. And the funny thing is, we talked to customers and they had zeros. In their mind, there was zero value in having more seats. And there was an investor, early stage investor in Typeform, who actually told me that his entire company essentially has a single account with Typeform. He's an investor in Typeform, and they share that account with 200 employees, right? Because they just don't see value in having multiple seats. But on the other hand, they see a lot of value in getting more responses. So when you charge per responses, it makes sense. Charging per seats, you're just blocking the growth and adoption. Because if you make seats for free, 50 people, 70 people, 100 people will adopt it. They'll make more surveys. They'll collect more responses. So I think it's really important to, starting from the first principles, really go to your customers and start asking them how they think about the value they're getting.
I absolutely love this because I know you also try to do this at Smallpdf in many cases. I feel like in my head, if I had to reformulate this, if you try to force retention through a feature like this, like, have more seats, and sometimes it makes more sense to have more seats, I'll give you that, all of this is fine. Maybe you should rethink whether the price of a product should actually scale more directly with the value that you deliver, as you said, through the responses and so forth, because it also makes the customer more willing to pay. One of the things that you do not want to have is some company that scaled, has 500 seats of something, then they have to downscale to 200. The CFO looks into the licensing and says, why do we have this? Get rid of it. And then you lost the customer, and you maybe made 6 months or 12 months of more money because they didn't know that they had a specific license. And this is problematic. So companies still tend to have trouble with that. All right, let's maybe shift really quickly to Lokalise, where you are right now, because I died to hear the story there. We did not talk about this very much. So can you maybe say one sentence to what Lokalise is doing right now, what you're doing there, and what the challenge is?
Sure. I think, Lokalise is an interesting business because, and by the way, we at Smallpdf still are and were customers of Lokalise prior to me joining. So I was in this lucky situation that I knew the product ahead of time and really enjoyed it. But most companies, and that really doesn't matter whether you look at SaaS or many other industries, completely do not localize their product, meaning it's offered in English. And I think for some markets, it's okay. We can say, okay, in the Nordics, people speak very good English. And in Netherlands, they speak very good English. And it kind of continues going down, and it's like less and less of this English adoption. And as a result, local players surface that essentially just offer their product in local languages. But I always wondered why so few products are actually offered in local languages. And there are many reasons, but I would say the biggest thing is just the amount of friction that goes in preparing for localization, managing the translations, managing content post-translation. And I would even venture to say, design teams have their design systems, but content teams, copy teams, don't even have copy systems. Nobody knows what's the latest copy, where is it used, how is it used, and now you have to manage it in 20 languages. Is extremely difficult. And then obviously you have to deploy the product and make sure that it's consistent and it's right and it works well across all the devices. Lokalise essentially makes that entire process very easy, whether you're working with machine translation or human translators, seamless, and it makes the copy management very easy as well. So that's sort of the goal. And I think from my perspective, it's very interesting because I'll be very honest, I've never localized the product prior to Smallpdf. It's a crazy thing, but most companies I've been with only offered product in English, and we never even asked ourselves whether we should translate it to another languages because there was no business case. No one even explained to me how big it is. We would localize customer support teams and put people on the ground in different countries, but we would still offer the UI in English and marketing materials in English, which is kind of crazy. And I think It was really at Smallpdf where we've been comparing markets like Brazil, where we had localization and local currencies with all the other markets,
Yeah,
and we're
that
like,
was fun.
"Whoa, why is it working so well? What is so special about this country?" And you're like trying to eliminate every other reason, and you're like, "Yeah, I guess localization has to be a big factor in the process." So I think that's number one. Number two, honestly, as someone who's lived in 8 or 9 countries and has to deal with stuff in local languages that I'm not particularly motivated to learn because I don't know how long
Mm.
I will be in that country, it's also a great saver for me if more and more companies and more products localize. And the funny thing, living 2 years in Switzerland, right? Switzerland is technically a 4 language country, right? However, and my wife is Italian, so I was thinking, oh, we're living in Zurich, but they support all the local languages. We'll be able to deal with everything in Italian. No, many government pages are not translated to Italian. You can't buy a car in Italian. Like the dealerships are only in German and French. And I was like, wow, how much more money does it cost to add one extra language on the website and support your further? I'm not even talking about Romansh, which is much harder to execute, right? So you have that, and I think in Zurich, 50% of the population speaks German, and you often don't even have an English as an option. And you just go like, how much business are you losing? I mean, there's so many things I didn't buy simply because I couldn't understand the page and I couldn't be bothered to essentially go through auto translation and try to decipher and so on. So I think it's a great opportunity. It's a great area. But there's one extra reason why I joined, to be very honest. And I think, I don't want to talk about like generative AI is going to change the world and so on. Everyone's talking about it. You sound like a broken record. But I truly believe in that.
Mm.
And while I talk to other companies, I didn't see the urgency to adopt AI, to really think about it as at the core of your strategy, not just, to power one feature, but to really empower everyone in the company to take advantage of it and to really think how it can affect every single aspect of your product. And when I talked to the localized leadership, they were all about it. And I think that was just a great alignment. I'm really passionate about the topic, love to learn about it. I wouldn't call myself a particularly good machine learning engineer, but more of a hobbyist, weekend hobbyist. But I love this topic. And yeah, and whenever you can pursue something that you love while you're working, it just makes work so much more fun.
I agree. There's a lot of good points here that I want to address. So this was also my first executive role in a machine learning model company where, I mean, not localized, but like at Jua,
Yeah.
where I am right now. And I thought I'm a technical person until I actually landed there. So first of all, every engineer and every researcher that we have on payroll probably has double the IQ that I have, which is very interesting, but I'm better at product than them. So I have that going for me. And it's very interesting how insanely complex product development can get until you have really seen it. Like if you develop your own models, your own language models, or your own whatever models, you will know what I'm talking about because suddenly you're almost starting to mimic like a hardware company. Because one of the things that we love in cross collaborative teams is we try to make them as small as possible to deliver some independent value. Front end engineer, back end engineer, designer, product manager, let's go, right? So you have 4 to 5 people as a minimum unit. Enter machine learning, you have researchers, you have machine learning engineers, you have AI engineers, you probably have some other functions that you've never heard in your life before you even start to add front end, back end, and then also ML ops in a 20 to 30 people company because everything is just so insanely big. And that was a huge challenge for me also, like to build a product organization that can sustain this. I think we did a pretty good job, but it was, it was a bit scary in this regard. I want to say like 2 things that you said on the side of localizing, because I feel like this is very interesting. I also learned this at Smallpdf. There are 2 things that I learned at Smallpdf that become interesting use cases or business cases with scale that I have learned before are not good business cases. And the first one is resurrection. Because if you don't have a specific scale of your users, it's not worth it to resurrect them because all you do is you just piss everyone off for like a 1% uplift. For instance, HelloFresh is doing this. Sorry for calling a brand out, but like they just really annoy me. And the other thing is localizing your product. And it is very interesting because, yes, the American market is usually the biggest one. And then English kind of works in Germany and it kind of works in France and so forth. But there's so many other companies with, I don't know, just like Latin, like the entire of Latin America. I think the market size is about a tenth of the American market. At this scale, this is definitely starting to work. And if you're just not touching it, why wouldn't you? Because content creation compared to sales, you can actually do as a geographical expansion without having people there. You can actually do a geographical expansion through content from a different country if you just hire native speakers or people that have lived there. So, at the very least, you should do it as an A/B experiment that is kind of like a big company initiative to see whether it's worth it. And that's why I'm really interested in this. And I think Lokalise is doing quite a good job. So, it's one of the tools that definitely survived for a reason also at Smallpdf. Yeah.
And it's an interesting thing because you said it kind of works, right? And I think the kind of works is the key thing to remember. Number one, the fact that I am German, for example, and can speak English doesn't mean that I want to speak English. Doesn't mean that I want to think in English all the time. And doesn't mean that it's not tiring for me to do that if I just spoke in German to all my colleagues and now I have to switch between languages all the time. So that's number one. Number two, marketing is often not localized, but you should check statistics for every country. Majority of searches are in local languages. So
Yeah.
you're essentially leaving a huge chunk of the potential demand simply because your content is not even found. And I
No.
think that that's sort of the challenge. I think what Lokalise has done extremely well, not just localizing the product, but really localizing marketing, landing pages, currencies. All of those factors had really big impact on adoption.
No. And I think you have to become global. Otherwise, your unit economics just does not check out
Yeah.
anymore. All this money that you make from these markets is also going into your English speaking market. So you better not ignore them.
Yeah, and the other thing is we talk about the US being the largest market, but the US is also the most competitive market. Quite often your customer acquisition cost could be 3-4 times higher than Europe and probably 15 times higher than Latin America. So is it really worth doing it?
Well, we will never know. We will never know because we're not localizing enough, but maybe we will now. So I'm really excited to see how that goes. AI has definitely shaken up that core business and also the core, like the learning business and so forth, and everything that around text that is coming from language models. So it is going to be very, very exciting. And I also know that you're someone that loves to practically learn in this regard, right? So, like, I know that you also have been playing around with AI yourself, like what can you actually do with this kind of stuff? And I love this approach because you like to also tackle things with, hey, there's a new challenge here. What can I learn about it on a practical way? And let's just maybe talk about this because you are in my book someone that is really that loves to learn. You definitely have a life of learning. This is something that unites us too. And I do it a little bit different, but maybe do you have a couple of thoughts on how do you become someone that learns really, like how to adopt this growth mindset that everybody's talking about?
Yeah, I would maybe separate the growth mindset from love for learning because for me, there are two different things. Growth mindset is this sense of, in mind, of confidence and resilience that you have when you fail because it does not reflect on who you are. It just reflects on what you have learned so far. Right. So that's a growth mindset. Right. I failed. Okay. Well, I didn't know that. That doesn't mean I'm stupid. That doesn't mean I cannot learn it. That just means that maybe I've prioritized wrong learning in the past. And I should prioritize this learning, maybe get a coach or do something else. And I think that's an extremely important mindset to embrace because it's very easy to develop a sense of insecurity as you go through life. And I think a lot of people have it, they don't admit it. But I do remember in my MBA class at Wharton, I think there was 100 of us in the class. And the first day, one of the admission, maybe it wasn't even the admission, so one of the professors, I think, asked us to raise a hand if you think the admissions made a mistake and you shouldn't be here. And I was absolutely convinced they made a mistake. I'm like, hey, this is a really good business school. Why am I here? Like, I'm not really that good. But then 90% of the room raised their hands. I was like, okay, so everyone thinks the same way, or almost everyone. There's this 10% who I guess love themselves much more, but all of us have this deep insecurities. And I think the growth mindset is just a reflection of that over time you realize that we are all flawed, that we are all somehow wrong, that we all make mistakes. whether it's someone you put on a pedestal, and I don't know who's on the pedestal right now. We used to put Steve Jobs, kind of Elon Musk. Some people put him on the pedestal. Some people, hate him. But there's many sort of, product heroes and engineering heroes and machine learning heroes, the Jan LeCuns of the world and so on. And you say, oh my God, they know so much. But there's also so much they will tell you they don't know. And they have these huge gaps. And I think, it's just a reflection of, we need to understand that we will never be perfect. We'll ever know everything. And we just have to choose what we want to learn. The love of learning is a very interesting thing, because that's a very, very different thing. That's essentially, getting dopamine from learning something new. And I think we as humans, we are naturally curious. There's sort of the curiosity gap, the concept in psychology that, like, why we need to see the next episode of a movie, right? If there's at the end some unresolved issue and you're like, oh my God, it's a week waiting, right? Or maybe with Netflix it's not anymore, but I'm going to binge through the entire series because I need to know why this happened, why that happened. And I think when we can apply it to a subject, you naturally are very motivated to continue learning, and it becomes very pleasurable. But the thing is, it usually doesn't work the way in the beginning. It's like, if you haven't seen a few episodes of a TV series, probably the gaps are not that relevant to you, because you don't know the characters, you don't know the plot, you don't know whether there's any relevance, you don't know why it's interesting. And I think with the new subjects, you have to dive into a little bit, but then becomes very addictive. It's like, I remember when we started talking for the first time, and it was so amazing to just like mention a book to you, and then you come back with 4 more. And like, oh, I've also learned this, and I've also learned this, and I love this. And what do you think about this? And then 2 months later, I realized that now I'm learning from you, because you've already outlearned me and you've already consumed much more. And now I can learn from you. And now I have these things that, like, I've never heard about that. Now I need to like pick up. And I think it's an amazing dynamic. And, if you have people like that around you, and you can learn from anyone, and you have this curiosity, you'll get there, and you'll start learning, because it's just fun. It's just fun to know something that you didn't know before.
I think so too, but I think I had a very big inhibition that might have been still present about 3 years ago. And it's funny to reflect on this, because I always loved learning in my life. I always did. I was always curious about the world, but something went wrong in my past, in the sense of, like, I started to learn a specific topic and then I declared myself too fast an expert in it. And also internally in myself, because in some way, I don't know whether this is true, but let's see where this goes. This is one of Leah's monologues where she just figures things out as she says them. In some way, I think I was searching for validation from others that my status is going to increase if I just learn enough about this topic to claim that I'm an expert in some way. And I remember very specifically that I'm the person, so I love to play games, right? So like, I'm in my friends group, I'm the one that just has like the biggest kind of game library and everything. Everybody comes to me when they want to have a recommendation. So I know enough about these games to kind of recommend something to you. Like, if you tell me like what you're into, then I can tell you like, okay, this is the kind of thing that might be working for you. And I did not realize that this particular value, being the connector of knowledge, is actually already quite valuable. It is extremely valuable, so you don't have to be the expert. And one of the things that I always struggled with, I think, no matter how much I want to, certain topics for me are forever closed. Like complex mathematical concepts, I probably never get. I just don't have to focus for it. My dyslexia makes it harder for me to understand them. They're just not worth it for me to learn at the same time. But I always try to be competing against some other friends who actually dedicated 300 to 400 hours into this one game, right? So then I struggled, because I'm like, I was always like the second best or the third best and so forth. And I think one thing that I developed from this was this hyper competitiveness that I turned into something healthy now, because I'm like, okay, I don't need to be an expert in everything. I just have this one topic that consists of so many different topics. Like product-led growth is about organizational scaling. It's about retention. It's about acquisition. It's about this and that. You're not coming to me if you want to figure out paid advertising. That's not what you want to do. But you're coming to me if you have absolutely no clue about your growth channels, and then I'll figure it out with you, because I know the people and the sources to get enough knowledge to kind of get there. And I never realized that this is also a talent in itself, and that you also have to leave a lot of stuff to others. The specialists have their place, and they should have their place. And it's fine to always want to learn new things, because there is value in connecting the world as it is from the strategic perspective, for sure.
Well, I would say disagree with you on one thing very
Uh-oh.
strongly, and I very strongly agree on one thing. So I disagree with you on the fact that you cannot learn something, because I've seen you proclaim that in the past, and then I've seen you master those things. And I think it's a question of the right, maybe delivery, the right packaging. A good example would be always a C minus in physics, all my high school. Good with math, but C minus in physics, because the teachers just taught it in a very theoretical, boring way. Then I went to the university and I had to learn how to do a basic platform game, and I had to learn physics around that.
No.
And then they just became so fascinating and interesting, and I wanted to learn as much as I could, because they were very practical, and I didn't have to imagine abstract concepts in my head. I could actually see the simulation of that. The game was essentially a simulation of all the rules I was learning. So, and sometimes it's about chunking, not doing 45 minutes in a row, but just learning a small concept every day, and then it does zap after 365 days. There's a lot of different things, but the amazing thing about you is that you kind of always think that you can do less than you can. And we had these discussions many times. And then you always not only outperform your own expectations, but everyone else's. So let me disagree with you on that limitation. The other thing that I very strongly agree with you is on the connector value. I think it was Adam Grant who maybe even wrote the book. I don't remember the title, but it could be even Connectors, about how actually the most valuable people around you are the connectors, and the best managers are the connectors, right? You will never have a manager who can coach you at everything. It's no way you can learn everything, right? You have to be
I
very
think it was Malcolm. I think it was Malcolm Gladwell in The Tipping Point or something.
That too.
Maybe.
In The Tipping Point, it was more about spreading, but Adam Grant
Yeah.
talked about in the concept of coaching and so on, and that the managers are the ones who actually connect you to the right people, to the right knowledge, to the right opportunity, to the right project. And having this ability to connect, it's not about the fact that I can teach you everything, because I can't, and I will learn from you as much as I can teach you. But if you have a specific topic and I know someone who can help, that's a huge difference you can make as a manager, as a friend, as a leader.
Yeah.
And I think this connecting, that's the other part, right? I mean, our brain very rarely, activates everything around. So we always think in terms of like very narrow silos. We sometimes cannot connect concepts in our head because it's very rare that sort of the brain works in that way. So people who have this ability to take very abstract ideas that are on paper not related, and then see how they shape a system, are extremely unique, right? And we often think of them as artists, because artists do it very, very well, and we consider that part of creativity. But that's also what we find very unique about people like Einstein and physics and so on, that they can find a few disparate concepts and they can find how they relate each other, or they can find how one is a metaphor for another, and then explain that concept from that perspective. So I think this ability to connect is underappreciated, because it's not like a skill you can test easily on a test, but it's really what leads to really groundbreaking, especially product innovation design.
Yeah. And ironically, I heard the best person to describe this was Steven Spielberg. I don't know whether you know it, but he's also dyslexic. And I was looking for videos. Of course, I did my thing, right? Like I started to research the entire topic because why not? So he was actually describing this quite interesting. So he also has dyslexia. And what he does is he said that whenever he had to read a script from a movie or whatever, it took him like 3 to 5 times longer to read it than others. But while he was struggling to read it in this way, the way that he retained it, like the interconnection of the characters, how they were related to each other, rather than just like having data points of like, okay, this person was wearing this and this and this. It was more, it seems to be different for people like us. And he said that was his strength about storytelling, because you're not concerning yourself with the details that just do not matter. You understand the bigger picture, whether it makes sense. And I want to say just one thing. So I kind of agree with your disagreement, but I also disagree with it in the sense that when it comes to machine learning, for instance, and the current state of it that we have, there is almost every 2 weeks a new paper that is coming out that is very relevant to the companies that we have. And believe me, I tried. I cannot read them. I cannot comprehend them. And the problem is because they have so many mathematical formulas in them, you also cannot read them out. And that's fine. I don't have to learn it in this way. But I learned from my staff PM, Ian, who is an absolutely incredible person to learn from. He's an astrophysicist. He told me that, hey, look into this guy, Feynman, and how he teaches about math. And Richard Feynman never uses math to explain mathematical concepts. And this was kind of my entry into cosmology, understanding quantum physics and so forth, because I always tried it from this way that I thought you have to kind of learn it. And this is kind of barred for me. And yeah, so I kind of agree that the form can make a big difference. But this is also something where I started to monetize it. I get physically angry at things that I do not understand. And then I kind of rewrite them in my head. And these are the articles that people see when they are going to my blog and also pay money for. And that's quite funny to me because I never thought that this is the way that it works. So my blog is essentially my notebook. And I'm very, very fortunate that people pay for that. So, yeah.
Indeed. Indeed. But
Yeah.
I still find it interesting that you get angry, or at least that's how you explain it.
You know this feeling when you try to do something, whatever it is, and you fail and then you try it again and you get a little bit better. That's one part of doing something. But if the conditions around it fail, so you cannot concentrate on the task, like you read something, but you cannot comprehend it. So you're like, oh shit, what did I just read? I have to go back. This is kind of like this experience of dyslexia when terms sound the same, when I mix up value capture, value creation, when I mix up SQL, MQL, just because it sounds the same. And I notice it much, much later. This is not getting better through repetition. And these kind of conditional things that are happening on the outside, they're very, very frustrating to me because it keeps me from actually learning something, because I only sometimes learn that, or like I notice that in post, oh, I actually did something wrong now because of something that is unrelated to the learning. Like it's too loud around me, or I cannot concentrate, I didn't sleep well, whatever. That kind of makes me angry. But I learned to be angry at these things. And I also had this at Smallpdf, by the way, a couple of times where I just did not understand a couple of stuff. But I took it and I knew I'm going to deal with this at some day where I'm rested and I can deal with it. And this is where this energy came from. I received quite a few times the feedback, I think also from you, that I tend to react quite emotionally. And I think this is what it is, right? So like this is this emotional response. Like I get very angry about things that I don't understand, that I cannot get under control. And then I try to wrestle them afterwards, which ultimately, if the output is this what it is, then it's kind of good and I'm fine with it. But I think it's more on the conditional side, or like the conditions around rather than the thing itself.
Yeah, but
If that
it
makes sense.
does. But where does anger come from, right? Like, why are we getting angry? It's quite often because we don't meet our own implicit expectations of how things should be, right? It's like, I should have learned it. But who said you should have learned it? I should have learned it by reading it. Who said you should have learned it by reading? Right. And I think, that's kind of what I think Rune is learning for a lot of people ultimately, that they try one way and they say, oh, I'm stupid, I didn't learn it that way. Versus, like if you experiment with this and you say, okay, I'll try to learn it this way. Oh, it didn't work. What are 10 other ways to learn it? Well, I have no idea. Okay, I'll go to ChatGPT. ChatGPT, or 10 other ways of learning this. Oh, okay, good inspiration. Let me try that, right? And then you eventually come up and you say, okay, I actually, for this particular topic, I don't really learn well when I'm reading it. For this particular topic, I need to hands-on actually write this stuff and kind of go through it myself. Or I need to do something completely different, right? Build a building. Write a game where I'm using it. Oh, now I understand how it works in the context. Okay, finally I connected the dots. And I think, our education system broke us. Let's be very honest, because it told us that there is one way of learning things. And if we are not learning that way, then there is something wrong with us. But it's really just something wrong with our education systems. Whenever we are put in the boxes, right? It's like people put you in. Okay, Leia is good with UX. Oh, so she probably doesn't know SQL. Oh, Leia knows SQL. Oh, so she probably sucks at UX, right? Because the PMs who are good at data, they cannot be good at UX. That just doesn't really work well together, right? Oh, she loves to interview customers and she loves to be involved with sales. Oh, probably she doesn't know how to talk to engineers. And it's like this boxing that people do to us that is so annoying, but then we do it to ourselves. And that's where, the limitation really comes from. Like, it's like the box that we put ourselves, and we said, I need to learn how the people in school learn. Otherwise, I'm not smart. No, half of the people in school don't learn that way.
Do you remember this conversation that we had at some point and I asked you, do you think you need to be broken to be successful? I actually asked you this
Yes, you
once,
did.
and I think it was about a year or 2 years ago, maybe 2 years. I don't remember. It doesn't matter. But I think a lot of this insatiable drive that I had in the past year when I came to myself and I just said, like, I'm going to make this happen, is probably also coming from some darker places. I had a lot of things in my past, in my youth, where people said, you will not stick to this, you will not do it, you will not finish it, right? And like for me, also typically a lot of the things that I did, as everyone, right? Like you start a couple of things and then you just don't finish them. Not exactly a perfectionist in this regard. I'm happy to kind of start things and then not finish them. But still, there is this voice of, why are you not finishing things? You can turn this sometimes into something very, very useful. And I remember this when I had a very serious talk with myself about a year ago, or a little bit more than a year ago. I was still at Smallpdf, and I said, this is not working out anymore. I need to grow. I need to grow hard, and I'm going to prioritize everything that I can in my power to work for 3 to 4 hours for myself every day. And if I cannot do it for Smallpdf because I'm learning new things, and I went hard until the last day, then I will use the remainder of the time for myself. And that was like the content production, right? So like writing everything down, trying to also research around ProducTea, like, discarding stuff that I did not know about. And I did not give myself a break in this regard, just because I wanted to prove it to kind of like some imaginary people that were not there. And the interesting thing is that this helped me actually develop a habit after a couple of months where I didn't need this motivation anymore, because I saw how it started to work and I saw the returns of, hey, this is actually a really good thing and I think I can do this and this is going to be my future. And then it started to replace it with a positive thing. So I still don't know whether I have the answer to this particular question. I still think it is a very interesting question, because maybe either all of us are broken in some way, it's also possible, or people who were broken in the past are just going the extra mile a little bit more. And I see this a lot in some founders. So my view might be very skewed, of course, but I think it is a thing.
Yeah, I would maybe agree to some extent. So I grew up in communism. I grew up and I was told that, I'll probably never leave Poland. Probably no one will ever let us go out of Poland. They will not give us a passport. And we'll probably, just do what we have to do for the communist government. And then, I left Poland, and like, I think in the early days of EU, the sort of the perception was that the Polish people are really good at cleaning and maybe plumbing, but that's about it. So, you kind of come to England and people are looking at you like, why you think you could be a manager? Right? I mean, like, Polish people, they work in the back of the kitchen. And, a few people actually did tell me that, right? So you develop a chip, and you have the chip from, the childhood and all the teachers who didn't believe in you and everything else. Like, like your entire life is like, you remember the people who didn't believe in you remember your failures, because we pay attention to that. And I remember I was at Leanplum, and the CEO there, Momcho, great guy. We spent a lot of time chatting. And one day he said, you have a huge chip on the shoulder. I love that, because it really, really motivates you, and you're like really highly motivated. And all the people with the chip on the shoulder have something to deliver. And I think we had a lot of people with the chip on their shoulder. But then I realized that the chip on the shoulder has also the negative side of it. The frustration when it doesn't go well, the frustration when you don't meet your expectation, the fact that you can never be satisfied, right? And for me, it's also the fact that if I look at my grandmother, who has a monument, and and she accomplished enormous amount of things in medicine and in government. My grandfather, my aunt, who was one of the first women at MIT, you kind of start comparing yourself to them, and you're like, oh, you're like the son of Michael Jordan who plays basketball in Europe, right? You're like, it's like, yeah, you're kind of a failure, right? Even though you might be a great basketball player, And compared to everyone, you're probably like really, really good, but like compared to these people, you're like very, very low. But then I realized, is this really true? Is this really me? Is this really where the life should be going? Or I shouldn't say I realized, right? There was always a therapist who can help you a little bit realize things, but you kind of arrive at the point when you realize that it really doesn't matter. And I think, for me, this was the Typeform situation where, I was supposed to join as a chief product officer, but then there was more openings and the CEO offered me to join as a COO. And I thought, oh, that's going to be interesting. I like, it's an A/B test whether I want to be a CEO in the future, right? Like, you cannot join as a CEO and quit after 2 years. That kind of sucks. But as a COO, like, you're replaceable. You can be changed and it's much easier. And sort of, let's say in the middle of this test, I realized that I would never want to be a CEO. That it's just not me, that I'm not enjoying it. That like the only reason to be the CEO would be the chip on the shoulder to prove that I can do it, that I can do more. But then when you find a role where you're actually enjoying what you're doing every day and you're learning for the sake of learning and it's fun and you're really enjoying different aspects of it, the chip on the shoulder is not necessary to work 80 hours a day. The same way as I don't need a chip on my shoulder to snowboard all day or play football with my son. It's just a fun activity. And I think, like, for me, that, it's 42, maybe 41 is when I had this realization, right? So I wish I had it much earlier. And if I had to give an advice to myself when I was 23, it would be exactly that, look for this realization. But it actually led to a situation where work became fun. And, you're on the weekend, you're working, you're like, because I like it, right? Like, oh, I'm just going to do a little bit today after dinner when kids go to sleep because I enjoy it. And I think you can get to that point. It's hard, and it's like you're pre-wired. The kind of the demons sometimes come back, and you just have to remind yourself that this is the past and this is not the person you want to be anymore. And that chip is not really a real chip because there's no one to prove, and no one really cares for. Like, that's the other part. Like, you're thinking you're proving something to someone, but honestly, all the people who criticize you don't care. If people want to criticize you, they'll always find a reason to criticize you. If they want to dislike you, they'll always find a reason to dislike you. So there's no one to prove. Nobody cares. There's only you. And you should find and do what you enjoy.
I think that is interesting because one thing that I learned as I got more prominent or like exposed in the market, let's put it that way, it is almost impossible not to have this one person or a couple of them that just they cannot stand you.
Oh, yeah.
And that's a very interesting thing because I always struggled with accepting that some people do not like me at all. But they exist. And there's a lot of them that exist, of course, because if you have an opinion, then this is kind of what's happening. So this actually helped me to disassociate from this a little bit. And just like you, I think I maybe really learned it when I was 40. Not before that either, I have to say. But I think, yeah, it's kind of like a little bit of a step performance. You got to get there, and then you just sometimes you're like, okay, whatever, let's just, it's fine. Because you're not going to learn otherwise how to define your self-worth.
It's a funny thing. I feel like we have this conditional love for ourselves that is really broken. And I'll give it to you on an example of a watch. So I think 11 or 12 years ago, I fell in love with a Panerai watch. I don't know why. Right? It's like it's a 5,000 euro watch, but it's something about the design, something about the look and feel, and so on. So I fell in love. I told myself back then, okay, the first time I actually get to lead a product team for a startup, I'll buy it for myself. And it happened. I didn't buy it. So, okay, yeah, because I have to save for an apartment. Okay, so when I put down the money for the apartment, I'll buy it. I didn't buy it. So, okay, when I get to an MBA, I'll buy it. Didn't do it. When I graduate, no. And there's like 10 different things when I said, okay, I will love myself enough to buy myself a expensive gift. I still don't have the watch. And I realized that it's all this conditional love. Like, you promise yourself that you will be happy if you do something, and then you do it, and like you're like, no, that's just not enough. I need more. It's a funny thing. Like, someone told me, that like the big problem that we have is that we have this concept of heaven and hell, and we believe that if we behave well, we'll go to one or another. And then they said, what if this is heaven? What if there is nothing afterwards? This is heaven. But you turn it into hell with all this like thinking and not accepting and so on. What if that's your only chance to be happy and you're just really, really hard at work? to make
No,
sure you're not. And you're like, oh shit, well, I cannot clearly debate that it's a possibility, right? It could be.
no. I think I only have two things, or like one thing to that. Every morning when I get up, I make a list of myself and what is a successful day for myself. And it's usually like a couple of tasks that I kind of have to do. And I started to switch my thinking a couple of months, maybe a year ago, where I was just like, actually, these are not tasks for a successful day. This is just like if I attempt to do them, because there's always like this one or two things on that list that you just really do not want to
Mhm.
do. But if I do start to attempt them, that means that I was starting to get up for myself, right? Like I stood up for myself and it did something for me. So the result does not matter. I'm just proud that I started to do it. Before that, I always got annoyed that I could not finish something,
Mhm.
right? So, like, this is a huge shift. And funny enough, isn't this also what we're preaching when we do A/B experimentation? It's not about whether you succeed, it's about whether you learn, it's about whether you did it. We never cared about the lucky strikes. Like, okay, like you didn't, you launched an experiment without testing it and you still got lucky. Doesn't matter. It's a shit procedure. It did not follow what you were supposed to do, because if it would have failed, you would have not learned anything from it. And I think it's the same with ourselves in many regards.
But it's
So,
funny because you're
yeah.
gamifying it, and I've been gamifying it too. And I would do like tasks that
Mm.
I really don't like, and one of them is taxes. And the Swiss taxes seem to be the most complicated taxes on the planet. American taxes are also somewhere up there, and I had to do both. And so I would do these things where I would first say, okay, when I finish taxes, like I will finish these 5 tasks, and then I'll play my favorite game for an hour as kind of a reward, right?
No.
Then of course I didn't finish the 5 in time to play the game, so then I changed the model to the time-based model. If I diligently work on taxes for 3 hours, then I'll play a game for an hour, and that worked much better. But then I realized that whenever I apply reward to something that is really boring, I make it actually worse for myself because I'm really
No.
seeing this as a negative. So then I started doing taxes for the sake of doing taxes, and now they are just not as painful.
Okay, so everyone who's listening who needs to have their taxes done, Mike is available for some extra work. He loves it now, so this is really good. Now you
I'm
you
bad at
you
it.
figured out why.
Yes, they don't bother me.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, love what you're doing instead of constantly wait for the other thing that you might enjoy. Mike, we've been going almost 1 hour and 15 minutes. I'm sorry, I promised you that we would stop 5 minutes ago, but do we have time for one more
Of
question? And if
course.
so, what trends are you betting on in the future? What do you think is going to be the next big thing that you are also excited about from wherever?
Yeah, I could say AI, but I think everyone said. I think what I'm really passionate about the last few years is, I would say, democratization of companies
Mm,
and flattening of companies, and the move. And I'm not going to go to say like every company will work like Valve in some kind of holocracy without managers. But I think hierarchies will disappear and will work more and more like open source communities, and we'll come together
mm,
and with the tools that enhance our productivity. Right. I think what AI does to us as individual creators, whether you're a software developer or designer or writer or anyone else, right, or even just conceptualizing things, is it makes you so much more productive and gives you so much power. And 20 years ago, if you wanted to record the record, you had to go to a studio, pay a lot of money, buy expensive equipment, spend weeks over there. And now you can do it at home. And you can be Justin
mm,
Timberlake recording at home. And now the same thing is possible for software engineers. It
mm.
was already possible a year or two ago, but now to a much bigger extent. Now it's possible for anyone to start a single person company, to be a sole entrepreneur, and not just consulting company or some kind of advisory, but really create businesses like, in SaaS and gaming and so on. And I think, the future will be amazing because we'll all be creators and we'll all be collaborating, and there will be these networks and the connectors will connect us all together so we can do more advanced projects together, a bit of like a global holocracy. And I'm really
No.
fascinated about that. I hope I'll be right because I know I'll really enjoy it. And I think it'll be really amazing to think that the open source community ideas can be applied to actually doing things commercially very well and collaborate and then distribute money, right, without a centralized source.
I think it's going to happen. One of my predictions 6 months ago, when all of this started to happen, is that we will have much, much more companies competing for the same market cap. And this is essentially the death of this unicorn idea or not successful thing that has been told as a story. I think we will have hyper productive, smaller companies who are definitely going to cap out at, I don't know, 30 to 40 million of revenue, and it's going to be completely fine. A lot of them will be bootstrapped just because they don't need venture funding to get there at that point. And that's fine too.
Maybe they'll even cap out at
I
5,
think
right?
we'll have that.
You don't even 30, 40, right? You can have 5, you can have 8 people working, you can be rich and happy and do something with your friends. And I think that's really exciting, right? And I think what it also does is we're chatting, and I'm in Lisbon. I moved here 3 months ago, and before I was in Zurich, and before that in Barcelona, and before that in San Francisco, New York, London, Helsinki. And I think it's amazing to be able to explore and get to know different cultures. And I think this democratization of work, and I don't call it remote work because I think remote work is different. You still work for someone else and you can change to a certain extent, but most remote companies will not allow you to change locales 6 times a year for tax reasons and complexities and so on. Well, this will really enable you to design the life however you want. And I think, it'll be interesting to see how people will break the boundaries of what we expect a life to be. Because we also grew up with certain idea like, okay, good life is this, right? You do this, then you do that, then this happens to you, then that happens to you, and then you die. And I think, I'm curious what the definition of good life will be 5 years from now, what the definition of good life will be 10 years from now. And I think that would be really fascinating.
Aim into that, and I think we will see it first in the tech industry, and then probably 50 years later in the rest of all the other industries that are starting to pull after.
Hopefully, it won't take that long.
But I don't know. We'll see. Okay, Leah will still be alive. We're gonna tune in again in 40 years to see whether these predictions came true. Mike, this was an absolute bomb and an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for doing this with me. Should people get in touch with you, and if so, how should they do it?
Oh, the easiest one is LinkedIn.
All right, then it will be in the show notes. And that's it for today. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. Thanks, Leah. So good seeing you. Bye.
Ba-bam! Done. Thank you so much for listening to the ProducTea with Leah. If you don't have enough yet, you can subscribe to my podcast right now on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or you can head to my website, leahtarin.com, which is leahtarin.com, where you can find much more of my material or just want to work with me.